commercial of cell phones, like, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? And it breaks up or it's staticky or whatever. In the analog world of radio waves, it was sometimes hard to hear people. And so as you're talking, your voice can actually become more distorted than hearing tones like do-do-do-da, do-do-do-do-da. It's easier to hear that sometimes than actual voices. And so there is, and especially in low frequencies or hard atmospheric conditions to transmit, Morse code can actually be sometimes better mode of communication than voice, believe it or not. So CW or carrier wave or Morse code is still used. On 1-3, there's a term that you'll have to know this. It's a test question. Well, when I say it's a test question, it's one of the 200. It may or may not be asked. So also keep in mind, if you have an area that's hard for you or difficult, you can miss 6 of them out of the 35 and you'll still pass. So it's like 74% or better or something, you can still pass. So don't feel like you have to know everything, just have the good concepts in mind. So on 1-3, one of the test questions is Oscar. So what is Oscar? And it's not Oscar the Grouch. Okay. Oscar stands for Orbiting Satellite Carrying Amateur Radio. So they have an example here of a Cube satellite from the 1950s, I think, or 60s that was used, and it was one of the first amateur radio satellites. So you actually, with your technician license, they give you privileges on the UHF band that you can transmit to satellites, and there are free satellites you can transmit on and receive messages on, which makes it fun and also extends your reach, more than just local VHF, UHF ranges. So satellite communication is something you can do. And so on 1-5, there's an example of a hiker, and you can actually take your radio up in a remote area, and you can hike and take it up really high and talk to people. A lot of amateur radios operators will do what's called contesting, and they'll do contests. Would you hand them a syllabus on the corner there? You did? Okay. So they'll do what's called contesting, and they will try to do contacts with people. And they'll say, okay, my name is, and they'll give their call sign, and they'll say, I'm located at this area in this time. And they used to do what are called QST, I think? No. They were called Q cards or something, and they would contact each other, write their name, their call sign, and they would get their address, and they'd say, okay, this is me, and they would mail it to them, and then the other person would mail them back, and they would collect cards. And so the more postcards you got, the more people you contacted, and they would do contests. So they do this virtually now. A lot of times you can just go online to a website and say, hey, I made a contact, make it official, and you keep a log of it. Some people like to do that. And so on 1-5, it talks to you about who can be a ham. Anyone from the age of 6 and up. So I had a person, like I was saying earlier, when I've taught this before, who was 12 and passed the test. My son is here with us today, and he's 12, and he's going to try to pass it. So cool. It's kind of like that show, Are You Smarter Than a 5th Grader? He's a 7th grader, so if a 7th grader can pass it, you can too. So it's a good challenge there. So another thing you can actually do is you can contact space station, the International Space Station. So you are allowed to talk to astronauts in orbit. Of course, you have to get on the right frequency and coordinate it and so on. There was an article in the news about 10 years ago of a local elementary school, or no, I think it was a high school in Salt Lake County, and they had planned this for like 2 years. We're going to talk to the astronauts on this time and this date, and if they have enough gap in their experiments and their workload, we'll be able to talk to them, and it worked out. They talked for about 15 minutes to the astronauts. The news media came and they covered it, made a story out of it, and it was kind of fun. And so you can actually talk to astronauts through just a technician license. So they've got some pictures here of the astronauts in 1-7 in the space station and talking to people. And then 1-6, they talk about the contests that I was talking about. So this is just kind of the intro part of it. Let's see.
No test questions on the chapter 1?
I don't think so. There's not a lot of test questions in that. Some of these concepts I'm covering, like the word Oscar, the amateur radio carrying satellite, that is a test question. What does it stand for? What is an Oscar? Another thing that ham radio is used to do, 1-9, emergency operations, and that was kind of my motivation to do it, was, in times of emergency, and I'll just share a quick story with you, but in times of emergency and times of peace, amateur radio is used. So In times of peace, for example, they use it to coordinate large events like parades and that sort of thing, public safety events. They will use it for the National Weather Service. So when you hear there's a tornado watch or warning or storm warning, it's because they have trained spotters that will go out and spot the weather in the clouds and say, okay, there's a funnel cloud, that's a real one, it's coming down, and they'll talk to the National Weather Service, they relay it, and then they send out a warning or a message. So it's actually used for weather operations as well. So the story for me is, in 1989, I was living in North Carolina, and Hurricane Harvey came in. And we were in this rural area about 50 miles north of Charlotte. We were living in a double-wide mobile home, and there was this forecast. It's about 200 miles inland. We didn't really think it was going to hit, but it did. And we woke up about 4 in the morning to trees crashing, one, another. We woke up the next morning, there was 20 trees just on our little half-acre lot. And we were without power for 2 weeks. And this was before cell phones. And so the telephone line was your telephone, and VHF TV and AM, FM radio was your way you interacted wirelessly with the world. And so when the power went out, the telephone system also went out, which a lot of people didn't realize that, the telephone takes electricity to operate too. And so what the telephone company did was they went to each of the little poles every so many miles, and they put up generators to power the poles in the phone system. And a lot of the teenagers were at home because they couldn't go to school, so they got on the phone and started talking. And so it jammed up the lines, and then they're like, well, why don't we get to FM radio station guys and tell them, hey, all the teenagers listening out there, just get off the phone. We need the telephone lines for other things. And the same thing can happen in cell phone networks. In an emergency, voice lines are quickly jammed, and so people will text. But if the power's out for an extended period of time, like days or weeks, those cell phones towers take power to run. Some of them might have batteries for a day or two, may even have a generator, but if it's a week or two, chances are you're not going to have cell phone service. And internet service takes power to run the routers and all the equipment that gets the internet to your house. So even if you have power, your internet may not be working. So a battery-operated ham radio might be one of your few means of communication. Let's see. So let's see how we do. 18 minutes. All right. So they also have clubs and organizations. I've talked about a couple in the Utah County area. There's a nationwide one, ARRL. They're a publisher of this book. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about unlicensed radios. Okay. So Palmer, can you get me the FRS radios and one or two of the ham radios? So without getting a license, so if you decide you don't want to take the test, there are what are called FRS. It stands for Family Radio Service. You can get those at like Walmart, Costco, that kind of thing. There's 22 channels that the FCC has allocated for FRS. This is what an FRS radio looks like. It operates on the UHF frequency. It has 22 channels. It's pretty easy. You just hit the menu, go to channel 11, go to channel 12, and push and start talking. Real easy.
Is that like a typical walkie-talkie?
Yeah, it's a typical walkie-talkie. The downside with FRS is you're limited by the FCC on how much power you can use. Some channels are half a watt, and then there's some channels that are 2 watts. Half a watt might go a mile or two. 2 watts might reach 20 miles. One time we went to Antelope Island, and we had these, and my son was listening, and there was somebody on Antelope Island down to Bountiful, and we could hear and talk to them 20 miles away. It was direct line of sight. They were probably up on the mountain, and we were down, and there wasn't anything between us. So you can go 20 miles, but typically 5 miles or less. There's an alternative called GMRS, General Mobile Radio Service. And all you have to do for that is just go to the FCC, pay a license fee of like $35 for your family. You don't even have to take a test. And they give you access to this, same frequencies, but higher power. You get 2 things. You get higher power, I think you can go up to 5 watts or something. And you also get access to repeaters for FRS, which I'll talk about repeaters. That extends your range. I'll talk about that in a minute. But for the GMRS, you get access to the repeaters and a higher transmitting frequency. And that you don't have to take a test for. So that's the first option, and without a license. So on that 1-11, they give you some lists of unlicensed personal radio service. So most of you are probably familiar with CB radio, Citizens Band. They tell you a little bit about it. It's got 40 channels. Channel 19 was real popular for the truckers. And so they would say things like, you'd hear truckers talking, and we used to have them when we were growing up. Breaker, breaker, 19 for a radio check. My name is Mojo. When you'd have some kind of handle and you'd talk to the truckers. And it was kind of fun because they'd say, oh, there's a police guy ahead, or there's a traffic jam, and you can kind of talk to the truckers and get a road report real time. So that was kind of fun. Or we'd say, hey, can you honk your horn? And they'd go, and we thought that was fun as kids. And so you can talk to the truckers or just use it for personal use. So we had 3 cars at one time because I'm the oldest of 7. So there were 7 kids, mom and dad, there was 9 of us. There was a couple times where we had 3 cars and we all had radios and we were all talking to each other. So that's, one, you could use the FRS now for that purpose. But so CB radio has 40 channels, goes about 10 miles. Marine VHF for boating, 50 channels, goes about 20 miles. And the FRS, which I've talked about, 2 miles is what it says here. Multi-use radio service. I'm not sure what that one is, if that's the GMRS or what, but that's another option that it mentions in here. Okay, so those are some of the unlicensed and the licensed versions. Okay, so let's see. 1-13 talks about the FCC and licensing. There is what's called the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. And also kind of interesting to note, the call signs are like international. And they're used for not only amateur radio, they're used for TV stations and radio and even aircraft. So in the US, for example, all the aircraft have tail numbers that start with N for November, and they all start with N, and all the N numbers mean it's a US licensed aircraft. And your call sign as a pilot is the same as your tail number. So when you get your pilot's license, you're automatically authorized to operate on the aircraft band, which are VHF, 100 megahertz range, and your call sign is your tail number of your aircraft. So when you go from different aircraft to aircraft, your call sign changes based on what aircraft you're flying. With the FCC, you just get a license. You can use it for any radio, anywhere you're at. You just you're supposed to have your license with you. So they let you just print it off as they give you like a PDF or something. You print it off from home and you get your license. Put it in your car or whatever.
Can you pick your call sign?
They do have what's called a vanity call sign program. So you get an initial issued call sign, and then you can apply for a vanity call sign. So for example, my instructor, the shorter call sign indicates more power and more privileges. So he had his call sign he applied for was NOAA, N0AH. So his was NOAA. I thought it'd be fun to have Adam, but I'll get into that more later, that they restrict the call sign based on the country you're in. So N, I'll give you the mnemonic. This is a little bit jumping ahead, but the mnemonic is AKNW, Alaska, Northwest. AK for Alaska and NW for Northwest. So if you remember AKNW, all call signs in America, in the US, have to start with an A, a K, an N, or a W. So like WBL Chicago is the radio station, KSL is the radio station, TV station, radio station. They all start with K, S, A, K, N, or W. So all the aircraft are N, and when I got my call sign, it was KC0QZS. It's based on the location where you apply. So I applied in Colorado, and this area of the country, they all start with K. If you hear somebody with a W call sign, that is in the East Coast. So you can kind of tell where people got their call signs. Sort of like Social Security numbers used to be. The first 3 digits used to be based on where you applied at the time you got your Social Security number. They've since changed that. Back to the ITU. So the International Telecommunication Union, that's kind of like an international body that has rules and regulations they all follow. These countries will follow, and they all coordinate that so that their call signs and their frequencies don't overlap and interfere with each other. And so so with the ITU, those are the call sign letters that we use in the US. Let's see, so 1-14, I've talked about this in the intro. We've got the technician, the general, and the amateur. They're called elements, sub-elements 2, 3, and 4. I think element 1 is the Morse code test, that's why it starts with 2. But it's 35 questions, passing grade is 26 out of 35 correct. So let's see, what is that, 9 questions?
9 questions wrong.
Or 7 questions wrong?
9.
6, 4, my math, 9 questions, yeah, thanks. My math on the fly. Anyway, so you can get 9 questions wrong. 26 is correct or higher, then you can pass. And it tells you on the right what kind of privileges you can get. So with the technician, it's VHF and UHF, and general is those plus HF, and then extra gives you all privileges. So I've talked about contacts. Some of the lingo on 1-15 is called CQ. CQ is just a general call or a contact. So if you're on I don't do any of the Morse code stuff, so I don't do Morse code like to communicate, but if you were, you would say CQ, 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 and that means calling anybody out there, you need to respond. So CQ is just anybody talk kind of thing. 1-15, they give you a little bit of the history of the word breaker. So we have in our lingo today, sorry, I'm breaking in on your conversation, or I'm interrupting, right? So that came from, the word originally referred to a telegraph operator disconnecting or breaking the telephone line so that no characters would be sent. This got the attention of every other operator along the line, and to do so was called breaking in. The word is still in use 150 years later, so that's where that came from. They also have what are called Q signals, which I'll go into those a little bit later, but telegraph operators adopted a little shorthand. They were 3-letter codes starting with the letter Q, probably because the letter Q wasn't really used in the English language, so they just did a bunch of 3-letter Q codes, and it was a shorthand way of communicating an idea. Like a QSO is referred to as a conversation, QSO. QTH, if you say what's your QTH, that means your location. So those are 1-15, they talk about that, those Q signals a little bit. There's a list of them later that I can go into. Now I'm going to talk about the different modes of communication. So most everyone's familiar with, the cell phone using data to transmit. Well, that data goes over the airways. It uses a frequency, 700, 800, 900 megahertz. They're all different standards depending on what type of cell phone network you're operating on, which carrier you have, and what frequency spectrum they're licensed to use through the FCC rules. So there's data, digital data. 116 talks about digital data. I've talked about Morse code, or CW. It stands for carrier wave. That's another way you can use the spectrum. Another mode is voice, which I've talked about. That's just picking up the phone, talking to people, which has kind of become a lost art now, right? We do texting. We mostly do data with our cell phone, but same thing applies with ham radio. You can do voice, you can do data. They also